Welcome everybody to this session about a stochastic model for neuronal activity. Let me start thanking the organizer for this opportunity. And each speaker will have 20 minutes plus 5 minutes for questioning. And our first speaker is Ryota Kobayashi from the University of Tokyo, who will talk about modeling spike frequency adaptation of a neuron and its potential role for sensory encoding. Please, Ryota, can you start?
Yes. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, and thanks for inviting me as this session. And I will talk about this title, but mainly today I will talk about the first part about how to model a single neuron or something like that, and the mathematical modeling about single neurons. And today I will talk about the information processing by a single neuron, and so maybe most of you knows about it, but I will briefly summarize what is happening in the neuron. And neuron receives the input current, and this current consists of excitatory and inhibitory, some of excitatory and inhibitory current, and they receive fluctuating and noisy current. And receiving this noisy current, our neuron is an element in the brain, generate spikes. And spikes is very important. And this spike information is conveyed the further neurons. And we are interested in how this spike information is processed in the brain, and it is to develop or consider potential application, how this scheme can be used, and so on. And briefly, in my talk, I summarize how to model single neurons, and I hope maybe next speakers focuses on more stochastic aspect of the neuronal processing. And let me start from the modeling a neuron. And to build a neuron model, we first simplify what is going on in the neuron. And this middle panel, this one, indicates what is going on in the cell neuronal membrane. And typically on the neuronal membrane, there is a ionic channel, which are special selected, some selected special, only selected ions can go through. And there is a repeat bilayer. So simplifying this part, we can consider simplified electric circuit model, which is sort of the parallel circuit. One consists of capacitance, which corresponds to repeat bilayer, and this resistance. So resistance corresponds to ion channel. And we can derive very simple linear first order differential equation model. And but it's too simple, and because this model is linear and does not generate any spikes, so we have to modify this model to generate to make a neuron generate spikes. And one more essential feature is the neuron has a spike threshold. It means if the neuron generates spikes, it means when the voltage reaches to some threshold here, the neuron generates spikes. So by combining this linear model and the threshold model, we can develop a very simple. It is a very famous model. It is known as a leaky integrated fire model. Essentially, this model consists of integration of input and the spike threshold. And by simulating this model, we can generate a sort of the we can simulate periodic output in response to a constant current, right, like this. But unfortunately, there are diversity. There are many types. There are various types of neurons, and so if this model is correct, all the neurons should fire regularly to this constant current. But nature is not so simple. So you can see this shows examples. So this is in this panel, the experiment did injected various neurons, and they did experiment on typical 4 types of neurons: regular spiking, and fast spiking, and chattering, and bursting neurons. And all the case, the experiment that is injected constant current and no stochasticity there. But you can see from this figure, all the most neurons does not generate regular spikes, except for this fast spiking neurons. And regular spiking neurons, they initially generate frequent spikes, and but it goes to regular and tone down and regular spiking. And chattering neurons repeated sort of the bursting spikes. And intrinsic bursting spikes initially generate spikes with very high frequency. It is called bursting, and they going to silent. And it's unclear for how this neuron generate these kind of mechanisms. And today we focus on 3 questions. And first, we want to think about how this neuron generate this variety of response patterns. And then we think about how this property is implemented in physiologically. And finally, we think about how this adaptation property is useful for neuronal coding. But today, mainly I will focus on these 2 questions. And let's start from the first one. And so to develop a simple model, and we think very fast, we start from a phenomenological model, and it is called a multi-time scale adaptive threshold model. And in this model, it's quite phenomenological, and we just extend the original, integrated fire neuron, the threshold is a constant. But this model, we extend this model to a variable, time-dependent variable. And the threshold increase after each spikes, self-generated spikes. After each spikes, the threshold of the neuron increased the sum of exponential functions. Typically, we consider 2 time constants, slow and fast, and increase and decrease exponentially. So this is very simple model. And we have 3 parameters as a constant, and the weights of the fast and the slow, the coefficient of the fast and the slow component of exponential function. Okay. And but though it is very simple, but interestingly, this model can achieve a very high predict accuracy. So this is an example of the experimental data, and so the top panel shows fluctuating current, And this red one is a response to actual 3 neurons. And in this experiment, we did 3 types of neurons, regular spiking and bursting and fast spiking. And the red one is experimental data, and the blue one is prediction by this MAT model. And you can see from this figures, you can see MAT model can predict firing patterns of these variety of neurons. And if we examine carefully, quantitatively, we can see this model can achieve approximately 90% of spikes with error of 2 milliseconds. And furthermore, so there is an international competition for predicting neuronal responses as accuracy as possible. And our model won these competitions. And and not only that, recently we explore various examine various experimental data, and interestingly, in olfactory neurons in insects, this adaptive threshold model is a very sort of the adaptive threshold mechanism is essential to reproduce experimental data. And for example, this left panel shows receptor neurons in mouse, and the receptor neurons is first neurons. When we sniffing the smell, it is the first neurons. And so there is a comparison, and you can see the dashed lines are experimental data, and this green and this real lines is fit by the model. And you can see the LIF model cannot fit this experimental data, but the adaptive threshold model, they can accurately reproduce these experimental data. And not only the first order neuron, interestingly, the second order neuron, projection neurons, it's a second order. So the first neuron is a receptor neuron, and the information is transferred to the projection neurons in the insect olfactory system. And we can do the similar analysis to the experimental data, and we can also confirm this adaptive threshold is essential. Spike frequency adaptation is essential to reproduce this experimental data. And but some question arises. So this model is so good. So can this MAT model reproduce everything? And unfortunately, it is not. And this MAT model cannot reproduce all the response patterns proposed by Izhikevich, and who developed a mathematical model based on bifurcation theory. And but if we extend this model, we can reproduce all the response patterns proposed by Izhikevich. And what is missing? The missing component is a voltage threshold, voltage dependent threshold. And we briefly explain the model, and the difference of the, so by incorporating this voltage dependent threshold, we can propose an argumented MAT model. And the key difference is this term. And this is the theta is again the threshold, but theta is dependent on the derivative of the threshold. And this is essential to reproduce remaining variety of response patterns. But if we incorporate this term with spike frequency adaptation, even though this model is sort of the piecewise linear system, but this model can reproduce all the response patterns proposed by Izhikevich. And then we go to the second question. So, but we focus on the first adaptation term in this talk. The second question is what is the physiology underlying this spike frequency adaptation? And to think this question, we consider the more biophysical neuronal model. It is a nonlinear differential equations and consists of sodium, potassium, and slow potassium, and the calcium dependent slow potassium current. And this is a spike generation current, and this is a slow potassium current. And we cannot talk about the details, but by approximating the spikes as pulse and using linearizing approximation, we can somehow derive reduced mat-like neuron model from this Hojikin-Huxley model. And interestingly, this term consists of 3 terms in the spike frequency adaptation. And this first term, it's a fast time constant, which corresponds to the fast sodium and potassium. It corresponds to the original Hojikin-Huxley model. And this second term, it consists of M current. And interestingly, this M current, the time constant depends on the V voltage. And you can see the last term is AHP. And we can summarize this part by comparing to other models. And this slide, we compared the proposed MAT model with Hojikin-Huxley and the integrated and fire model. First, we compare the prediction accuracy. And while these conventional models can predict 55 or 60%, the proposed model can predict around 90%. So it achieves a very high accuracy. And as we explained before, the MAT model can also reproduce diverse firing pattern. And the nice feature of the MAT model is that there are only 3 or 4 parameters. And in terms of speed, speed is computational speed. It is also important for the brain simulation. And we can show this proposed model is comparable to the LIF. So it's quite fast. And finally, we explained before, the MAT model is also, we can show it's connected to Hojikin-Huxley. So it's a slightly worse to this model, but the MAT model is also interpretable to some extent. And we can also compare this with Izikevich model. And unfortunately, Izikevich model, it's difficult to quantitatively fit the model because the Izikevich model is inspired from the bifurcation analysis. So bifurcation structure is a topological feature of the model. So it's very difficult to fit statistically or quantitatively. So that's a difference between 2 models. And another difference is computational speed. So because this Izikevich model is a nonlinear model, so it's difficult to develop, simulate efficiently. And of course, interpretability is not, we don't know how to connect to Hojikin-Huxley model. And so we can conclude the MAT model is suitable for simulating brain. And finally, we don't have we don't have not so time, but finally we slightly explain how this spike frequency adaptation can be useful for neural coding. And it's sort of the ongoing work. And we are now sort of the modeling the projection neuron, second order neuron in the fruit flight. And we are doing simulation. And this is the input firing rate to the neuron. And this is the output firing rate to the neuron with adaptation. And this one is without adaptation. And we consider second layer neurons, input and output, just a very simple neural network. And we can see that with adaptation, the response achieves sort of the peak But without adaptation, so the response just copying the input. So this result suggests a spike frequency adaptation facilitate the neuron to detect the changes in the input. And also, we don't talk about in this presentation, but another feature is another feature of the sort of the spike frequency adaptation is that maybe it is also useful for saving energy, as Lubomir Kostal showed, so it improves the information transfer performance per spike or per energy. So this is another aspect how spike frequency adaptation is useful in the neural coding. And I also personally think maybe it's in future work, it will be very interesting to implement this sort of the spiking neural network with adaptation to developing sort of the neuromorphic engineering and to investigate further about the neural coding. And finally, I summarize. I talked about the 3 research questions, and the first question is how does a neuron generate a variety of response? And this is a key feature is a dynamic spike threshold. And the second question is potassium currents. And finally, so the spike frequency adaptation can be useful for change point detection, but need more works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryota. Questions? I see a question on the chat. What did we learn about the brain from your model?
That's a difficult question. But one aspect is spike frequency adaptation is implemented most of the excitatory neuron. And I think the reason is maybe the brain is very severe to save energy. So like not rich people, we are. So neurons are, so neurons are very serious to save energy. That's the reason maybe most of the neurons have a spike frequency adaptation.
Are there further questions or comments?
I do have a question.
Thank you. Yep.
So Ryota, you mentioned about the convenience of your model against the leaky integrated fire model.
Yeah,
If I remember correctly, in your model, you have a term that is proportional to the first derivative of V, and that's a sort of memory term. Right?
Augmented version.
And no, at some point you had like a bit with an integral over when you
this one.
Isn't it? So if I were naively to implement that term, I would expect that to be really a time-consuming thing. So how did you get around that so as to make your performance as good as the Leaf model?
Yeah. So but there we assume. So I'm not this. I'm not the author of this paper, but yeah. So the key point is we assume special kernel function for K. Of course, you are right. If we assume general K, but we assume exponential function or something like that. This integral can be semi-analytically solved. So this equation can be transformed to a system of linear differential equations.
So you have effectively an additional linear equation as opposed to
yes, a linear equation for theta.
Thank you.
And the linear equation can be analytically solvable. That's a key point, yes.
I see another question from William Brown. In the past, in the last part, you showed how a neuron with SPA can detect the input change in its firing threshold. How does this depend on the adaptation timescale? And can you use that information to figure out which current likely cause SPA in that neuron?
It's a good question, but so sorry, we didn't have investigated detailedly about the dependency on the time scale, but yes. I think this so this is in general this property is robust to the small changes in the time scale, but of course, if it is too large or too small, maybe the performance can will drop.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, you see that there is some sort of decay, right? From this peak, there is a decay, like
Yes.
in this, and then I mean, there exactly, yeah. So relaxation to some constant firing rate, and I mean, I would say that probably depends on the adaptation MAT.
Yes, you are right. You are right.
And
yes,
and because previous, so basically, I asked this question because previously you showed that different currents give different time scales, and I just thought that okay, maybe this is a way to say which in this model is or which in this neuron, because it's a biophysical thing, right? Is that work?
Yes. Thank you very much. And this in this case, this time constant is fitted from a fruit fly neuron, and the time constant is quite relatively I guess the time constant is approximately comparable to the calcium.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I think it's time to stop and to move to the next speaker.
Yes, I will.
I'm sorry for the other questions that were not answered.
I will reply on chat.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much.